Mr. Mercer, effective the 1st of next month, Space 14B is being reallocated to a current board member under Article 9 of the CC&Rs. Please remove your vehicle and personal effects by the 30th, or the vehicle will be towed at your expense and the space reassigned. That letter came from Renata Hollis, president of the Ridgecrest Commons Homeowners Association, on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October. She had signed it in blue ink above her name and her title, and below the signature she had pressed a small, embossed seal into the paper with what I imagined was considerable satisfaction. A seal that she had apparently ordered from an online office supply company because it left a faint ring in the paper stock that meant precisely nothing under state property law. Renata had been president of Ridgecrest Commons for 6 years. She drove a white luxury SUV with a vanity plate that read RNCMNS, which I assumed stood for her name and something about the community. Parked it in the fire lane in front of the mailboxes whenever she had board business to conduct, and wore a pressed blazer over her workout clothes to every community meeting, as though the blazer converted the outfit into a uniform. She had never, in 6 years, walked to the far end of the property and looked carefully at what she was administering. What she did not know, when she sealed that envelope and dropped it in the outgoing tray, was that Space 14B was not a common area parking allocation. It was not an HOA managed resource subject to the CC&Rs. It was not a common element over which she had any authority whatsoever. It was a separately recorded, deeded lot. It had its own plat entry in the subdivision survey. It had its own tax parcel identification number filed with the county assessor. It had its own chain of title running unbroken through the county register for 11 years. Back to the week my wife Connie and I sat at the closing table and signed the documents that made it ours. What Renata thought she was reallocating was a parking space. What she was actually claiming was my real property. I had the deed in my filing cabinet. I had the assessor's confirmation. I had the plat reference. I had the tax bills going back 11 years with my name on every one of them. If you were standing where I was standing that Tuesday morning in the driveway, holding that letter, knowing exactly what those county records said, knowing exactly what your late wife had insisted on, when she put her finger on that plat map and said you were buying it outright, what would you have done? My name is Dale Mercer. I am 58 years old, and I spent 31 years in construction cost estimation, first walking sites in steel-toed boots and reading plans in site trailers, and then as a consultant reviewing closing packages and development cost models and plat surveys for builders and investors across 3 states. I have spent more hours reading recorded documents than most people spend reading anything. And I know the difference between a common area designation and a separately recorded parcel the way a carpenter knows the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. I am not a lawyer, but I know what a deed looks like, and I know what it means, and I know that it means something different than a line item in a community association's governing documents. I bought my townhome at Ridgecrest Commons 11 years ago in the spring with Connie, and we bought it the way Connie insisted on buying things, which was carefully and with attention to the kind of detail that most people skip because they are tired and ready to be done with the paperwork. Connie had grown up watching her parents negotiate with landlords and management companies and association boards, and the conclusion she had drawn from all of that watching was simple and firm. The only parking space worth having was one you owned in fee simple on a recorded deed with a tax bill in your name. She had said this more than once over the years, the way people repeat the things they actually believe rather than the things they only think. When the developer's sales agent showed us the floor plan and mentioned, in a fairly casual way, that the detached garage units at the rear of the development could be purchased separately as their own recorded parcels under their own deeds, Connie put her finger on parcel 14B on the plat sheet and said, without any particular drama, "That one. We buy that one outright." It cost us an additional $14,000 at closing. Parcel 14B was recorded in our joint names as a distinct piece of real property, separate from the townhome itself, with its own deed, its own tax parcel number, and its own appearance on the subdivision plat. It was not an easement. It was not a license. It was not a common element subject to HOA governance or CC&R reallocation. It was titled land, and it had been titled land for 11 years when Renata Hollis told me to move my truck. Connie died 3 years ago, of a cancer that moved through her faster than any of us had been told it would, and faster than any of us were prepared for. Kyle was 14 when she died, and he is 17 now. He is tall and quiet in ways that remind me of her. The same patience, the same way of watching something carefully before commenting on it. He still has the glow-in-the-dark stars on his bedroom ceiling, the ones she helped him stick up there when he was 6. Because neither of us has taken them down, and neither of us is going to. Kyle drives now, or is learning to. The garage at Parcel 14B is where his car and my truck sit side by side, on a concrete slab that Connie's insistence at a closing table 11 years ago made ours in a way that no HOA letter, no CC&R provision, and no board resolution could reach. It is not a sentimental object. A deed is not a sentimental object. But the person who made you get the deed is woven into it, and that weight does not go away. The day the letter arrived, I read it twice standing in the driveway, once quickly to get the shape of it, and once slowly to make sure I had not misread. Then I went inside and pulled the manila folder from the second drawer of the filing cabinet in the hall closet. The fat one held together with a rubber band that I have added to steadily since the week we moved in. Inside it were the deed to the townhome, the separate deed to Parcel 14B, the closing disclosure showing the separate purchase price, the plat reference sheet, the first 4 years of tax bills with Connie's name and mine printed at the top, every HOA notice and community newsletter I had received in 11 years, and a legal pad with dated entries going back to the first community meeting I attended, which I attended because Connie had put it on the calendar. I found Parcel 14B's deed. I found the tax parcel number. I found the plat reference sheet and looked at the spot where 14B was outlined in the survey. I confirmed what I already knew. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote Renata Hollis a letter. 2 paragraphs. Certified mail, return receipt requested. I told her that Parcel 14B was not a common element, not an HOA managed resource, and not subject to Article 9 of the CC and RS or any other provision of the association's governing documents. I told her it was a separately recorded deeded lot in my name, assessed independently under its own tax parcel number, and that any attempt to reallocate it, reassign it, or authorize the removal of vehicles from it would constitute an unauthorized claim against titled private property. I included the deed reference number and the tax parcel number in the text of the letter, so there could be no claim that she had needed to search for them. I asked her to confirm receipt and to advise the board that no vehicle would be removed from the space, and no change in usage would occur pending her review of the county records. I dated my entry on the legal pad. I sealed the letter, drove to the post office, and sent it certified. That was a Tuesday. I did not hear anything back. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived. It was printed on the same HOA stationery, with the same seal pressed into the same spot at the bottom, and it was titled Final Notice of Noncompliance in bold text at the top. It stated that my failure to vacate space 14B by the 30th would result in the vehicle being towed at my expense under the association's blanket tow authorization. And it noted that board member and treasurer Vic Sloan would be utilizing the space in the interim. I had already noticed Vic's dark Jeep in the garage bay on the days I moved my truck 3 times in the past 2 weeks. I noted it. I added the second letter to the folder. The next morning, I filed a formal records request with the county assessor's office to pull the official parcel status confirmation in writing, directly from the government record. The kind of document that does not require anyone's interpretation, and that cannot be argued with in any county office in the state. The confirmation came back in 9 working days. Parcel 14B, tax parcel number ending in 4421, listed as a separately assessed residential parcel. Owner of record Dale A. Mercer, no common area designation. Assessed and billed independently since the year of the original subdivision plat. I printed 3 copies. 1 went in the folder. 1 went in a sealed envelope I mailed to myself certified with that day's postmark, an old habit from fieldwork when disputed timelines were the difference between winning and losing a subcontract claim. 1 I set aside for the attorney. There was a community meeting in the first week of November, a Tuesday evening in the clubhouse, and Renata ran it the way she ran all of them. From a folding table at the front of the room with an agenda printed on HOA stationery, and a water bottle with the Ridgecrest Commons logo on the side. About 20 residents were there. I was there. Vic Sloan sat at the table beside her with a treasurer's report on a clipboard. Renata opened the parking section of the agenda by saying that the association was undertaking a comprehensive review of parking resource allocation across the community to ensure that resources were being utilized in alignment with community standards and the governing documents. She used the phrase community standards 3 times. She did not look at me when she said it, which was itself a kind of statement. I raised my hand at the appropriate point and identified myself, and said that I had sent the board a certified letter 3 weeks earlier identifying parcel 14B as a separately recorded deeded parcel not subject to the CC&Rs, and asked whether the board had reviewed that communication. Renata looked at me with the composed expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She said, "Mr. Mercer, the board has reviewed all relevant documentation and has determined that the allocation falls within the association's authority under Article 9. She said it firmly and moved to the next item. A woman 2 rows behind me, a homeowner named Gloria, who had been at Ridgecrest almost as long as I had, leaned forward and said quietly, "She's been like this with the backlot too. Greg was at the planning office last month. Something's going on with those parcels." I did not say anything to Gloria then. I wrote her name on the legal pad after I got home, and I added backlot and planning office and the date. And I put the pad in the folder. 3 days later, I called Pete. The attorney was a man named Marsh who had been doing property law in this county for 22 years and who I had worked alongside on a commercial development consult years earlier. He had the manner of a man who had read too many documents to be surprised by anything a document could say, which was exactly the manner I was looking for. I called him the morning after the assessor's confirmation arrived, and I went to his office that same afternoon with the folder under my arm and the plat reference copy Pete had made for me. Pete Calhoun is a retired licensed surveyor who lives 3 doors down on the east side of the development, a careful and thorough man who has maintained his own files on the Ridgecrest plat since before either of us moved in, and who I have had Saturday morning coffee with for 8 years. I had called Pete the week after Renata's second letter and asked him to pull the full subdivision plat from his files and explain to me exactly how 14B was designated in the original survey. Pete spread the plat on his kitchen table and walked me through it in about 15 minutes. Parcel 14B was drawn and designated as a separate residential parcel, distinct from every common element in the development, with its own boundary lines, its own plat reference number, and its own notation indicating separate assessment and ownership. Pete said, "She sent you a letter claiming she has authority over something that was never in her association's plat in the first place." He said it the way he says anything involving a surveying error, with a mild kind of exasperation at the basic failure to check the document before acting on an assumption. I asked him to make me a copy of that plat sheet, and he did, and I took it to Marsh's office along with everything else. Marsh read through the full folder for 14 minutes without speaking. He turned the pages steadily and without apparent emotion, the way a doctor reads a chart when the diagnosis is already clear. Then he said 3 things. He said the second letter plus the tow threat against a deeded parcel was a conversion claim under state property law. He said the documentation I had was more than sufficient to establish the parcel's status. And then he said something that was not about 14B at all. He looked up from the option agreement Pete had printed and said, "This LLC option on parcel 22. It hasn't been exercised. The seller is still the developer's estate." He set the paper flat on the desk. He said, "Are you interested in the lot?" I told him I needed to think about it overnight. He said, "The option expires in less than a month. Don't think about it too long." I should explain what Pete had found about the LLC, because it was the piece of the picture that changed what a parking dispute was actually about. Ridgecrest Parking LLC was a company registered in the state about 14 months before Renata's first letter to me, which put its formation in the same approximate season as the first community meeting where the subject of parking resource management had come up in what I was now retroactively recognizing as a rehearsed way. The company was registered to 2 partners, and one of them was Greg Hollis, Renata's husband. Greg sat on the Developer Transition Committee, the holdover body that had authority over the disposition of unsold and undeveloped parcels in the complex. The committee's charter allowed it to manage those parcels until the HOA completed its formal transition to full resident control. That transition had been in progress for 3 years. The Transition Committee had signed a purchase option with Ridgecrest Parking LLC, covering several parcels in the rear of the development, including a large undeveloped gravel lot designated Parcel 22. And the option also referenced what it called presumed common area parking resources, which included, by approximate location, the detached garage units along the East Row. The plan, as Pete and I assembled it over 2 more Saturday morning conversations, was to consolidate those parcels and spaces into a managed paid parking operation serving the entire community, generating revenue for the LLC and for whoever had brokered the Transition Committee's cooperation. It was a straightforward property capture scheme dressed in HOA procedure. Renata was either its front or its true believer, and I suspected she was both. She had never checked the deeds on the detached garage units because it had never occurred to her that anyone would have bought one outright rather than accepted it as an allocation. That incuriosity was the exposed hinge the whole plan swung on. Pete put the option agreement printout flat on the table and put his finger on the expiration date and said, 31 days from today. I drove home and called Marsh. The offer I made on Parcel 22 was a cash offer at full asking price with no financing contingency, no inspection period beyond a title search, and a 3-week closing window. I had kept savings from the consulting years, funds that had accumulated because after Connie died, I had not found anything that felt right to spend them on. And I moved a portion of those funds into a dedicated account that afternoon. The developer's estate attorney called me back the following morning and said the seller accepted. Closing was set for 23 days out, 8 days before Greg Hollis's option was scheduled to expire. I did not mention any of this to anyone except Marsh and Pete. I did not mention it to Renata. I did not mention it to Greg. The following 2 weeks continued as they had been continuing. Renata did not respond to my certified letter. Vic Sloan parked his Jeep in my garage bay on 4 more occasions. I noted each date on the legal pad. I added each notation to the folder. The folder was getting thick. That had always been the purpose of the folder. What I did not fully account for was that Renata was the kind of person whose confidence did not diminish under resistance. It accelerated. She had sent 2 letters and received 1 polite rebuttal, and had seen no legal action, and had watched Vic park his Jeep in my garage without consequence. And she had concluded from this that she was winning. Some people escalate because they know they are wrong and want to make the fight expensive. Renata escalated because she genuinely could not conceive that she was wrong, that someone else had a document she had not accounted for, because in 6 years of running the board, no one had ever produced a document she had not accounted for. She had never needed to know what was in the deed. She had never needed to walk to the back of the property. The letter on HOA stationery had always been the end of the conversation, and she had every reason to believe this time would be the same. On a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of November, I drove to a material supplier 40 minutes south for a project consultation. I left the truck in the garage, took my car, and told Kyle I would be back by early afternoon. Kyle had a half day at school and would be home around noon. When I pulled back into the development at 12:30, the garage bay was empty and there was a tow company sticker on the door, orange, with a reference number printed in black. Vic's Jeep was parked inside. I was still reading the sticker when my phone rang. It was Kyle. He was home 10 minutes ahead of me and had come outside and found it already done. Found his car alone in a half-empty garage on a deed that belonged to his family, with a stranger's vehicle in the bay next to his. His voice was level because he works hard at being level, the same way his mother worked at it. But I could hear the effort in it. He said, "Dad, your truck's gone, and there's a sticker." I said, "I see it. Go inside. Lock the front door. I'll be there in 2 minutes." He said, "Okay." He went inside. I stood in the driveway for a short time and let the thing I was feeling settle into something I could use. They had used the HOA's blanket tow authorization to pull a vehicle from a privately titled parcel. That was not a procedural dispute. That was conversion of private property. That was the line across which Renata had just walked with both feet. And she did not know she had done it because she had never checked the deed. I called Deputy Reese from the driveway. Reese had been out to Ridgecrest on complaint calls twice in the prior year and knew the development's layout and the HOA's recent history. He arrived at the development 40 minutes later in a county cruiser and walked to the garage with me, and looked at the tow sticker, and looked at the Jeep, and looked at my copy of the deed, which I had brought out from the folder. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's Vic Sloane's vehicle." I said, "Yes." He said, "And this is your deed for this specific parcel?" I said, "Yes." He wrote something in his notebook. He was careful with his language, the way a good officer is when he is being as helpful as his role allows, measuring what he could do against what he wanted to do. He told me he could not make an immediate civil arrest on a conversion matter, that it would need to proceed through the courts or the county attorney's office, but that he could accompany me to the county recorder's office and could confirm the parcel status on the public record with me present, and that doing so that day would establish a clear dated timeline of official confirmation. He said that the tow company's blanket authorization, if issued on a false premise of HOA ownership over private titled land, had exposure. He said that a documented pattern of an association official taking actions premised on a false jurisdictional claim was something the county attorney's office had standing to review. He said to file the towing complaint in writing that day and to get my truck back from the yard. I filed the complaint before I left the development. I texted Marsh the same information. Marsh had letters drafted and sent by that evening. 3 letters, one to the tow company's registered attorney, one to Renata Hollis by certified mail, one to Greg Hollis by certified mail at his business address. The letters named the deed. They named the parcel number. They named the tow as an unauthorized removal from private titled property. They named Ridgecrest Parking LLC and the option agreement and the transition committee, and Greg Hollis's name on the LLC registration and the financial scheme that the series of events was beginning to outline. They named the dollar amounts on the conversion claim and the associated costs. I did not see the Hollis household that evening. I drove to the tow yard, paid the release fee under written protest, took my truck back, and added the receipt and the written protest to the folder. I added Reese's name and badge number and the time of his callback to the legal pad. I put the legal pad in the folder. The folder was very thick now. The county recorder's office is on the second floor of a building downtown with high ceilings and old linoleum and the smell of paper that has been stored for a long time in a controlled environment. A smell I associate with documents that have been telling the truth for decades and will go on doing so after everyone arguing about them is gone. I was there at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, 3 days after the tow, with Pete in the folder and his plat copy. Deputy Reese arrived in uniform at 9:05, a presence that established the gravity of what was about to be confirmed. The tow company had sent its attorney, a compact man named Briggs, who sat at the edge of a bench near the counter with a yellow legal pad and the restrained expression of someone who already suspected his client's position was weak. Renata had retained a HOA litigation attorney named Fisk, a man from a firm that specialized in association disputes, arriving in a charcoal jacket with a leather portfolio and the particular confidence of someone accustomed to homeowners retreating before the paperwork even came out. He opened by stating that Parcel 14B was a common area resource designated under the association's governing documents, that the reallocation had been conducted under Article 9, that the tow had been executed under a properly authorized blanket removal order, and that the matter was a straightforward enforcement action that had been mischaracterized. He used the word mischaracterized twice. He was fluent and steady, and he had clearly delivered versions of this same opening statement in front of versions of this same counter on multiple occasions and had usually had the other side back down. The county recorder at the counter was a woman named Bev. She had worked that counter for 17 years, had the unhurried manner of someone who has seen every variety of documentation dispute that human disagreement can generate, and was waiting with the patience of someone who already knew what she was about to look up and already knew what it was going to say. She asked for the parcel number. I gave it to her. She typed it in. She waited perhaps 15 seconds for the record to load. She turned her screen a few degrees toward the counter, a small gesture, nearly absent of drama, so that the people standing across from her could see what was on it. She said, Parcel 14B, tax identification ending in 4421, deeded residential parcel, owner of record, Dale A. Mercer, no common area designation, assessed and billed separately since the year of the original subdivision plat. She paused. Then she said, with no particular emphasis at all, this parcel was never a common element. I set the deed on the counter. Pete laid the plat reference sheet next to it, with 14B's boundary outlined in pencil and the notation indicating separate ownership. The assessor's confirmation went down next, with a certified postmark envelope clipped to the back. 11 years of tax bills in a neat stack behind that, every one of them with my name printed at the top and 14B's tax parcel number printed in the account field. 11 years of clean title, 0 fines collected, 0 HOA authority ever recorded, 0 jurisdictional claim that survived contact with the actual record. Fisk looked at the screen. He looked at the deed on the counter. He looked at the plat. He opened his leather portfolio and looked at whatever was inside it, and then he closed it. He did not say anything. Briggs, the tow company's attorney, said in a quiet and businesslike voice that his client would settle the removal claim and costs and wanted to move toward a resolution. Deputy Reese said in the same even tone he used to describe everything, that the county attorney's office would be reviewing the transition committee's option agreement in the context of the documented pattern of misrepresentation, and that Greg Hollis's registration as a partner in Ridgecrest Parking LLC was information the office would want to discuss with him directly. Nobody had asked Reese to say that. It was the documentation generating its own result, the way documentation does when enough of it arrives at the right place at the right time in front of the right authority. The closing on Parcel 22 happened 4 days after the recorder's office meeting, on a Friday afternoon at the title company, 2 miles from the development. I signed the warranty deed and handed over the certified check and drove home with the new deed in the folder on the passenger seat beside me. 8 days after that closing, the option Greg Hollis had signed through Ridgecrest Parking LLC on Parcel 22 expired without exercise. Because the lot now belonged to me in fee simple, and the option had never been formally exercised before the seller transacted with me instead. Greg had apparently called the developer's estate attorney the week before the option expired, according to Marsh, who heard it from the estate's counsel. The estate attorney told him the parcel was no longer available. That was the full conversation. 3 weeks after the option lapsed, Pete pulled the state business registry again. The same quiet Saturday morning routine over coffee in his kitchen. Ridgecrest Parking LLC had filed for voluntary dissolution. Without the detached garage parcels and without Parcel 22, the managed parking scheme had no operational footprint. The revenue model required controlling enough deeded private parking to justify the management infrastructure. And it had never controlled any of the deeded private parking it had assumed it was controlling. And now it did not have the undeveloped lot either. The whole scheme had been premised on Renata never looking at the deeds. And Renata had never looked at the deeds. And that was no longer a viable operating assumption. Vic Sloan resigned from the board 12 days after the recorder's office meeting, citing personal scheduling conflicts in a 3-sentence email to the community mailing list that I read carefully to see if it contained a statement of accountability. It did not contain a statement of accountability. Renata stood for re-election to the board presidency at the spring annual meeting and lost to a retired school administrator named Carl by a margin that made the count feel ceremonial. The HOA, under Carl's leadership, reimbursed me the tow yard release fee, the tow company's civil settlement, and the legal costs Marsh had billed in preparing the letters and attending the recorder's conference, all itemized and paid before Fisk's firm closed the matter. There were 11 other homeowners in Ridgecrest who had purchased detached garage units under separately recorded deeds at original closing, the same way Connie and I had. 3 of them had already received letters from Renata's board implying their spaces were subject to reassignment under Article 9. Once Marsh's cease and desist circulated through the community's attorney service and was shared by 3 of those homeowners on the community list, the letters stopped. Gloria, who had whispered to me at that November meeting about Greg in the planning office, was one of the 3. She sent me a short note in the spring that said only, "Thank you for the folder idea." I added it to the folder. Those 3 homeowners did not have to appear anywhere or file anything or confirm anything they did not already have. The deeds they had signed at their closing tables 11 years ago had already answered every letter Renata could have written them. I think about that often. I think Connie would have found it satisfying in the precise way she found anything satisfying that confirmed a principle she had acted on years before anyone else thought it mattered. On the afternoon I closed on Parcel 22, I came home, parked the truck in the garage, and found Kyle in the kitchen with his homework spread on the table. I set the new deed on the counter and put the key from the title company, a plain brass key to the utility gate on the gravel lot, next to the folder. Kyle picked up the key and turned it over in his palm slowly, the way his mother used to hold keys before she decided what she thought about them. weighing the object as though it had something to tell her if she waited long enough. He did not ask me what the lot was for. He understood, I think, in the way that 17-year-olds sometimes understand in the whole shape of a thing from a single piece of it. That this was about something larger than a gravel lot. He put the key on his ring with the others, and he went back to his homework, and I went to start dinner, and the house was quiet in the particular way. It is quiet when something that needed to be settled has been settled. The people in it can go back to the ordinary business of the evening. Here is what I want you to take from this, the plain practical part. Because this story is not useful to you unless you leave with something you can apply. If you own a parking space in a condo, a townhome complex, or any planned community with a homeowners association, find your closing documents today and read them carefully. Locate the deed, if there is one. Find the tax parcel number for that space. Determine whether the space is listed as a deeded parcel with its own tax identification or whether it appears as a common element in the HOA's governing documents. That distinction is not a fine print issue. A deeded parking parcel is real property. It has a separate tax bill in your name. The association cannot reassign it, reallocate it, or authorize the removal of vehicles from it, because it is not the association's property to manage. A common area parking allocation is different. A common area space can be reassigned or modified by the board under the CC and RS, and the board does not require your individual consent to do it. You need to know which one you have, and you need to know it before someone sends you a letter. If you are not certain, call your county assessor's office and ask for a parcel status confirmation on the space by address or approximate location. Pull the original subdivision plat from the recorder's office and look for your space's designation in the survey. Keep the deed, the parcel number confirmation, and the plat reference in a single folder you can put your hand on without searching. Build that folder before the letter arrives, not after, because a folder you build in response to a letter is a folder you are building under pressure, and pressure is a poor condition for careful work. Document every communication you receive from your HOA, and keep your own dated notes on anything that affects your property line, your parking, your access, or your utilities. A recorded instrument and a dated paper trail are not dramatic tools. They are the ordinary discipline of a careful owner, and they work while you are at work 40 minutes away, and your kid is at school and someone else has decided the letter is the end of the story. Drop your own experience in the comments. If you have had a board or an association or a neighbor make a claim against something you owned on paper, I want to hear it. Subscribe if you want to follow along, because next time I'm going to tell you about a veteran who trusted his HOA to maintain the fence line along the western edge of his property for 20 years, never measured where the posts were actually set, and one morning found a licensed surveyor telling him he was standing on his neighbor's land 6 inches at a time, 20 years in a row. That one needed a county hearing and an iron survey stake and a property line hearing to correct. I will see you there.